Hello again. Hope you had a wonderful weekend. We're here for part two of our reading of David Maraniss's When Pride Still Mattered, A Life of Vince Lombardi. Part one, mainly, again, as I mentioned last time, you don't have to be a football fan for this one. It's just you go back and it just kind of takes you back in time to a time of your youth, and we haven't even really touched on football yet. It's just been about Vince growing up and his environment in Brooklyn. Very unusual, where he's got an orchard, basically. His family has a Shetland pony. It's a huge family. And Vince basically just decided that he would really like to be a priest. Well, as we know, that's not exactly to be, but there are other things in store for him. So we'll get right back to our story now. Vinny was sponsored at church by Sonny Jim Fitzsimmons, a horse trainer and family friend who lived in the neighborhood and took a liking to Tony, the barber's grandson. Despite his nickname, Sonny Jim could appear stern, but to Vince it just seemed that he was taking his vocation seriously. The racing sheets were his catechism. He was a daily communicant at early morning workouts. Accessorized with hard boots, walking stick, and stopwatch, he headed out to the morning tracks on muddy spring mornings, often taking Vinny along for the ride, godson and talisman. One August, they went to Saratoga together for a spell of the upstate racing season. Horses had an esoteric appeal to Vince, but he was too heavy to be a jockey and never imagined amassing the wealth of an owner. He played basketball but was too stiff to excel. In baseball, he was a rough-and-ready outfielder and catcher, but poor eyesight limited his skills with the bat. Football was his sports. He joined his first team when he was 12, a sandlot outfit that represented Sheepshead Bay in a Brooklyn league. They wore helmets and shoulder pads and green and white uniforms, and though the games were organized, parents were blessedly absent. The SHB boys coached themselves. Vince played fullback and helped design the offensive plays. Quote, "From the first contact on, football fascinated me," he said years later. Contact, controlled violence, a game where the mission was to hit someone harder, punish him, knees up, elbows out, challenge your body, mind, and spirit, exhaust yourself, and seek redemption through fatigue. These were the rewards an altar boy found in his favorite game. Contact and pain were not things from which the Lombardi family seemed to shy away. In later years, Vince explained his own occasionally violent outbursts by portraying his father as a harsh disciplinarian who would, quote, "hit you as soon as talk to you." There was some truth to this, if it described Harry's relationship with his eldest son, decidedly not with the younger Lombardi children. Harry showed a gruff exterior and talked tough about pain. Quote, "No one's ever hurt," he proclaimed when Vince came home from football practice with a bruised rib. Quote, "Hurt is in your mind." When he had been drinking too much wine or his preferred scotch, Harry could alternate between verbal hectoring and didactic posturing. He sometimes lectured Vince and the others on his triangle of success: sense of duty, respect for authority, and strong mental discipline. But behind his bluster and philosophical musings hid a soft touch who wanted to have a good time and knew that rules could be broken. There was in Harry still a bit of the wiseacre moon who marauded through the streets of lower Manhattan. One of his favorite stories was how he and his pals rumbled into restaurants in Chinatown and taunted chefs. One, he said, chased after them with a meat cleaver. And Harry was a prankster still. In Scrabble games with his wife, he invented words, many off-color. Nothing gave him more pleasure than his trick wine flask. After using it to fill his glass at Sunday dinner, he passed it around the table and laughed when it reached a first-time guest who poured and poured with nothing coming out, unaware of a secret button that needed to be pushed. On Thursday night, spaghetti night, in the Lombardi house, Harry piled his plate high with noodles, smothered them with red-hot peppers, and dug in. A smile creased his moon face as he fanned himself, his mouth burning, and exclaimed in his throaty Brooklynese, "Hey, Matty, whoa, this sure is good." Harry believed that his kids should not be deprived of the fun he was enjoying. Sometimes when he came home late at night with Maddie's brothers, Mike and Pete, cooked a juicy steak and awakened the children to share in the midnight meal. "Tell us a story," they implored him. And Harry invariably repeated the same one about a man who got into a fight with an Indian and twisted the Indian's nose upside down, and it rained, and the Indian drowned. No, they would say, not that one, tell us another one. Harry's effect on his first son was profound in many ways, but the image of him as a humorless autocrat pounding character into young Vince with his fists is mistaken. The first Lombardi mythology, which was steeped in patriarchy and needed a stern, original father figure. When a painful lesson was to be inflicted in the Lombardi house, more often it came from the back of the mother's hand. Maddie was taller and more refined than her husband, with a taste for clothes and a manner that some relatives considered haughty, hence her nickname, the Duchess. She was nervous and domineering, barking out orders. Her family creed was that there was no time for lolling around. She assigned children the most menial tasks. One was responsible for polishing the base of her dining room table every day. Everything with her, quote, had to be this way, the straight and narrow, all according to Hoyle. She had to make sure it was just right, even dessert not a little whipped cream out of place, end quote, according to Joe, the youngest brother. Harold, the middle brother, was late arriving home once and got smacked before he could offer an excuse. Quote, she would hit first and ask questions later, recalled Madeline, who was responsible for washing the dishes. Madeline remembered that her big brother Vince, as the oldest son, quote, which is a position next to God in an Italian family, had the fewest chores. But those he did have were strictly enforced. Quote, if I didn't do them, I was rebuked, he said later of his mother's discipline, quote, and not orally, I might add. By the time Vince became a teenager, his parents had transferred many disciplinary duties to him. He was foreman of the younger siblings. Madeline did the babysitting, but Vince was the enforcer, punishing them if they misbehaved when Mother was not around. Madeline's lingering memory of her brother during those years was that he was, quote, mean. And though he was generally well-behaved, his siblings knew that he was not the choir boy that he pretended to be. When he was 14, Madeline caught him sneaking a smoke behind the garage and informed her father. After being scolded by Harry, Vince set out to punish his little sister for snitching. Quote, he chased me and caught me and he let me have it, but good, Madeline recalled. Quote, I wasn't fast enough to get away from him. Meting out discipline was a role that he took to naturally and extended beyond the family, bossing around cousins and friends as well. Sometimes he could seem a bit much, more like an adult than one of them, but the older people loved him. Long before the outside world saw anything extraordinary in him, the family regarded Vinny as the favorite son. He was the prized nephew of Izzo, aunts, and uncles. They saw in him Maddie's intense perfectionism and the rustic physical features of grandfather Tony, the distinct jawbone, deep and dark-set eyes, shining smile, piercing voice. Harry and Maddie worshipped their first son more year by year. He was given his own bedroom. His family stressed to him that being average was not enough, that he was better than the rest. They played to win, from Grandma Izzo at cards to Father Harry at Scrabble. You could see it in their eyes. Beat Harry in Scrabble and his eyelids blinked violently, a trait passed on to Vince, whose buddies noticed it when they stuck him with the Queen of Spades in a game of hearts. He also had the churning stomach of his mother, which was one reason they both prayed to St. Anthony of Padua. Anthony was the patron saint of the poor, travelers, and those who had lost property, but also for the Izzos, the saint to turn to when overwrought with worries about the future. No one wanted Vince to spend his life cutting meat. There's a break here in chapter 1. I'm reading from my phone. I'll prefer to read from a physical book if I can, but to order one was going to take a few days, and I wanted to make sure that I could get to you right now. And we could read and share time because this quarantine is already long enough. So I didn't want to waste any more time. Anyway, that's why I'm phone reading. It's not optimal. Every weekday morning at 4:30, Harry Lombardi rose to make an hour-long commute through Brooklyn and across Manhattan to his place of business near the Hudson River waterfront at 23 Hewitt Avenue on the Lower West Side. There, down the block from the bustling Washington Market, he and his older brother Eddie ran Lombardi Brothers Wholesalers, a variation of the classic immigrant success story. Family legend held that their father, Vincenzo Lombardi, had been a silk merchant in a village between Naples and Salerno and had come to the United States in pursuit of an associate who had stolen from him. The story was hazy, and there were no records to substantiate it. The Lombardis, in any case, started over in America, in the commotion of a tenement house on Mott Street in Little Italy. Vincenzo hauled goods in a horse wagon before dying in early middle age, leaving his widow, Michelina, with 4 children. Eddie and Harry, the 2 oldest, had dropped out of elementary school and had begun working in their early teens, holding jobs as haulers and delicatessen butchers before opening a market of their own. Raw strength and street smarts were 2 qualities most useful in the wholesale meat business, both of which the Lombardi brothers had in abundance. Uncle Eddie was an intimidating hulk, well over 250 pounds. So massive, relatives said that when he died, they had to remove a door to get the casket out. He walked around with black olives in his pockets and dispensed them to customers and children as tokens of friendship. Whether Eddie was an entirely friendly sort is uncertain. Family stories offer suspicions of connections to black marketeering. Harry was a miniature version of his brother, though his dealings seemed more benign. Eddie and Harry flexed their muscles all day, hoisting 225-pound half-steers from delivery trucks, placing the slabs on rail hooks outside the market, and taking them down again to be weighed and cut inside the refrigerator room, which was large and cold, with sawdust on the floor. When Vince and his brothers and cousins were big enough, the heavy lifting was passed on to them. The 2 football-playing Lombardis, Vince and little brother Joe, could only laugh years later when asked if they had lifted weights. Never touched a barbell, they said, only slabs of dead meat. Bull meat was the Lombardi specialty, below top-grade fare that was sold to downscale chop houses and public institutions in the New York area for use as ground beef. Every Monday and Wednesday, Harry traveled to slaughterhouses in Secaucus, New Jersey, and Brooklyn, stamping LB into his selections with the company ring. The meat was soft and warm when it arrived at loading dock, and the trick was to get it inside, weighed, boned out, and refrigerated quickly so the blood would congeal. Lost blood diminished the weight and the sale price. Although all the Lombardis knew their way around a side of beef, stories of accidents suffered by father and sons were part of the family lore. Working at the meat table one day, Harry cut his thigh when the knife slipped. Many years later, the same misfortune befell Joe. Vince once got caught on one of the belt hooks and vowed never to work at the meat house again. The Lombardi boys were repelled and fascinated by their father's trade, as they were by the waterfront scene. A New York working man's pasticcio of the ugly and the exotic. Rats scampering behind crates in the wharf shadows. Black market jewelers hustling wares on the sidewalks. Mob lieutenants stalking the corners. Cops on the take. Short-weighing con artists. And there in the middle of Washington Market, anything one could imagine. A magnificent cornucopia of pheasants from New Jersey. Colored birds from Manchuria. Mallard ducks and Canadian geese, wild turkeys from Wisconsin, grouse district from J.P. Morgan's private shooting preserve in Scotland, venison from Pennsylvania, reindeer meat from Alaska. Harry, the grade school dropout, could read and write and showed sharp business sense. His transactions with wholesale customers were in pennies, half-cent, quarter-cent, 7.5 cents off here, a nickel there. He could check the scale and do the arithmetic in his head. No one tested his IQ, but anyone who encountered him knew he was no easy mark. He was financially conservative. His motto, if you can't pay for it, don't buy it. He instructed his family never to buy on credit, a directive that Mattie followed, but not their daughter Madeline. As a teenager, Madeline enjoyed a few prodigious shopping sprees at Abraham and Straus department store, incurring debts that her doting father paid off for her. The imperatives of the industry required him to run the wholesale meat business on credit, but he hated to do so, especially after 1929, when many of the restaurants that bought from him collapsed in the Depression. He fumed when customers declared bankruptcy and reopened under different names. When President Franklin Roosevelt came along with programs to ease the way for debtors, Harry blamed the mess on him. The tattooed butcher had created a comfortable life for himself and his family, and he'd acquired the tastes of a middle-class, self-made man. All through the Depression years, he drove a black sedan. He registered as a Republican. After work, he settled at the dining room table for a snack of sliced apples and toasted Italian bread, sipped a tumbler of scotch, and read the New York Evening Journal, a step up from the sensationalist tabloids, chock-a-block with sports and columns. To ensure that his children would rise higher, he helped pay for almost everything they wanted, including private educations, and regaled them with aphorisms about freedom and responsibility. In the summer of 1928, after Vince had finished 8th grade at PS 206 in Sheepshead Bay, he faced the first critical decision of his life. Where should he continue his education? The choice he made, Cathedral College of the Immaculate Conception, diocesan preparatory seminary, reflected not only what he wanted to study, but also whom he hoped to become. He thought he was on his way to being Father Lombardi. Pursuing the priesthood was not an unusual calling for a studious Catholic boy then, not for an altar boy so earnest that he appeared at church an hour before Mass, but it was out of the ordinary within his family. When Father McCarthy accompanied him to Cathedral's offices on Atlantic Avenue at St. James Place to register for the 6-year high school and college program, Vinny became the first among the Izzo and Lombardi clans to prepare for religious life. Not a priest or nun in the lot. There was one other curious aspect to the decision. The school had no football team. Cathedral Prep was 3 stories of gray stone, long rows of ancient windows topped by spires and gargoyles. Lombardi reached it by taking the Brighton Beach Line to Prospect Park, catching the Fulton Street elevated to Atlantic, and walking 2 blocks through a working-class neighborhood. A diverse faculty of priests from the Brooklyn Diocese ran the school. Some of them were sarcastic, others gentle. The experience brought more discipline to Lombardi's days and instilled in him many rituals he continued into his adult life. He was required to wake before dawn to attend Mass at St. Mark's, and his attendance was recorded with X's and O's in a book that the priests checked regularly. Daily Mass became a lifelong practice, often cited as evidence of his extraordinary faith. True enough, but as Lombardi himself explained in later years, he was expected to worship every day when he was growing up, so it had become a habit. His religion was as much a matter of discipline and routine as devotion. The boys wore suits and ties, a formality that he maintained and expected of people around him in social situations thereafter. Along with academic subjects, he studied church doctrine, the Nicene Creed, martyrs in the church, and articles of faith, and though the specifics of these lessons receded with time, the essence of the dogma stuck with him. He was imbued with the notion that success came with faith and obedience to superiors. Vince is making me feel rather shabby in my Harley-Davidson hoodie right now, but it is Harley, and Tomahawk, Wisconsin makes Harleys, so it's a civic pride thing, not a slovenly issue. That's what I'm going with. I hope you buy that. He learned Latin from Father James Smith, 9 parts taskmaster, 1 part humorist, whose teaching style, making the lessons clear to even the slowest pupil, was one that Vince would emulate. The coach in baseball and basketball, Jocko Crane, was a level-headed layman who treated the boys with respect and drilled them in the importance of repetition and the necessity of mastering the fundamentals. The assistant coach, Father McGoldrick, was Lombardi's sponsor and impressed him with an ability to make the boys believe in him without private doubt. That was not always an easy task. These would-be priests were full of vinegar. Quote, "We would try to get away with anything we could down there," said the Reverend Larry Ballwig, one of Lombardi's classmates. The one teacher, a naive Irishman, tried to teach through dramatics, but, quote, "guys would run roughshod over the poor guy." No student dared run roughshod over Spike Hyland, a priest with the disposition of a sweatshop foreman who was Cathedral's disciplinarian and oversaw the jug, that's after-school detention. Hyland often kept an entire class after school and gave the boys tedious assignments as punishment. Write out the principles of geometry, but print every 3rd word. He was a skeptic who doubted that most of the boys wanted to be priests or had what it takes to be one. Quote, "None of you have the vocation," he would say dismissively to his charges. Quote, "You don't, your mothers do." There was a method to Hyland's madness. The Brooklyn diocese was then overflowing with aspiring priests, many of them, as Hyland pointed out, sent to seminary by Irish and Italian mothers who wanted one of their sons to wear the collar. Mattie Lombardi was among them. Quote, "My son's going to be a priest," she boasted proudly to neighbors. As a student and athlete at Cathedral, Lombardi was good but not outstanding. Yet he stood apart from the boys anyway. He was scrappy and used his head. His grades were mostly B's. He stammered while reciting Latin and Greek, but plowed his way through both languages. He was surprisingly light of foot, but rather uncoordinated in basketball, where he played center on a lackluster team. He could win the center jump by anticipating the referee's toss. His nickname was 2 Points Lombardi. The derivation is unclear. More likely it means that he might score 2 points a game than that he was a sure shot. As a utility outfielder and catcher, he barked out orders to his more talented teammates. He was also injury-prone. Quote, "Lombardi, by the way, has more injuries than Hoover has commissions," a student journal noted dryly. He was remembered at Cathedral for 3 characteristics: his smile, a sudden wide flash of teeth that heated the room, occasional eruptions of anger, and his physical maturity. He had the body of an adult at age 15, his own adult body, in fact. He was the same height and almost the same weight as a freshman at Cathedral, 5'8" and 175 pounds, as he was in his senior year at college. It was his intimidating physical presence and his desire to lead that helped Lombardi get elected president of his section of 35 classmates, known as Class B, 4 years in a row, unanimously every time. The student magazine proclaimed that he could have the job for as long as he wanted it. In his yearbook pictures, dark, wavy hair, sharp suit and vest, arms folded in a menacing pose, always seated next to the priests in the front row, he appears several years older than his classmates. Quote, "He looked mature. He was a serious guy. He always had this smirk on his face," said classmate Joe Gartner. Quote, "When I saw him look at me, I would always wonder, is that unveiled contempt or veiled admiration?" As class president, Lombardi's prime function was maintaining order, much as he did with his siblings and cousins in Sheepshead Bay. The boys stayed in one classroom throughout the day, with priests coming in to teach various subjects. Between periods, they might be alone for 5 minutes, and Lombardi was determined to keep order. At the first rumbling, quote, "All right, fellas, keep quiet." A minute later, quote, "Come on, fellas, quiet." Then if the hubbub persisted, he rose to his feet and let loose with a ferocious command, "Shut up!" which everyone did, according to Larry Ballwig. Vinny's eruptions were often followed by, quote, "outbursts of laughter that made him a likable fellow," recalled another classmate, John B. Healy. In his third year annual, he was described as, quote, "the guy who wisecracks his way through class." There was, along with his emotional manner, a bit of mystery to him during his Cathedral days. Few of the boys knew much about him outside the classroom. They called him Tony, a nickname that he used nowhere else. They knew that he played football on a sandlot team on Sunday afternoons. The boys had Thursday and Sundays off, but went to school on Saturdays. Every now and then he arrived at school with a black eye, which he earned boxing in a Golden Gloves program under a pseudonym. The Cathedral priest disapproved of violent sports. The only thing worse was going out with girls. Boys found to be dating faced suspension. This was an essential part of the culling process. Only a third of the students survived the first 4 years of high school at the seminary. During a retreat at the end of their third year, a Franciscan priest led the boys in a vocational incantation. Quote, "I want to be a priest," he intoned in a thick German accent, directing the students to repeat the phrase with him. "I want to be a priest. I want to be a priest." Oh, I think we're pretty close. Let's go a little bit longer. I never want to go over 30 minutes. I don't want it to be too much where you're like, let's get this done. So just another section let's do. In the end, Lombardi could not say the words with conviction. He left Cathedral in 1932 without completing the 6-year program, overtaken by the realization, he said later, that he, quote, "was not intended to be a priest." As much as he had tried to direct his thoughts to the peaceful realm of God's salvation, he could not divert himself from earthly temptations. He loved physical contact more than spiritual contact, and could not shake his preference for the game of football. That sport was considered a virtual sin at Cathedral. An essay on athletics in the 1931 Cathedral Annual explains the school's opposition to football, making a case that would echo through the decades. Quote, "Many undesirable results and conditions, physical, moral, and intellectual, are brought about by football. Athletes are very liable to physical injury and strain through overemphasis and overspecialization. Football tends to further the advancement of destructive and detrimental moral results. It indubitably leads to the adoption of questionable ethical practices and unsportsmanlike conduct. It sanctions the evasion of rules, trickery, undesirable recruiting practices bordering on professionalism, and a lack of courtesy. There is a regrettable psychological effect on the players. This effect is brought about by newspaper publicity, building up individual prestige instead of praising the machine-like functioning of a team. False attitudes are taken by the student body, which revels in its athletic accomplishments while neglecting the real purchase of education." End quotes. None of this meant much to Lombardi. He simply loved football. At the first opportunity, he persuaded friends to jump on the subway with him and ride up to the Polo Grounds to watch the professional giants and big-time college matches between Fordham and Pitt. He followed football avidly each fall in the sports pages. All through his Cathedral years, despite the discouragement of the school's fathers, he kept playing sandlot football. As some of his teammates turned 18, the good ones who played on major high school teams told him stories about college recruiters dangling scholarships. Vinny's resistance to the outside world was already weakened by uncertainty about a life of celibacy, and also by the demanding seminary curriculum, as well as by what he thought somewhat ashamedly was his unpriest-like temper. And finally it broke down. Football was out there, and he wanted in. That'll be the end of our Part 2 segment for today. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks again for listening. For our friends and neighbors who are in retirement and nursing homes throughout the region, we're thinking of you. We want you to stay safe. We know it's difficult not having any visitors, so hopefully I get to keep visiting you for a while, and you will enjoy it. And to other friends as well who are just social distancing, like my family as well, and many families all the way across the Northwoods, again, keep it up. You're doing great. Stay safe. And thanks so much to our medical professionals who are working like crazy right now. All the doctors, nurses, EMTs, everyone involved with the medical profession. We know that you don't have what you need right now, that there are shortages all over the place, and you're doing your absolute best. And we're thinking about you. And yeah, that's it for this week. Thank you very much. Oh, again, for David Maraniss's book, it's When Pride Still Mattered, A Life of Vince Lombardi. It's great. Buy it. Give Maraniss your money. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He deserves it. This is a lovely book. He does other great work as well. You can grab it at Amazon, or even more preferably, get it at an actual bookstore if you can. And also thanks to WJJQ. This is my radio station. Mine, I don't own it, but this is where I'm a DJ for providing, all the stuff. So thanks very much, and I will hopefully get to see you tomorrow as well. Have a wonderful day.